Part 8. Book quote reading from my Zen Mind Balcony. The Heart of Trauma. Healing the Embodied Brain in the Context of Relationships by Bonnie Badenoch, author of Being a Brain-Wise Therapist. The heart of trauma succinctly informs the therapist that the objective of trauma therapy is to enable the client to experience feelings of safety. This beautifully written book describes the scaffolding of disparate neural systems with interactive pathways detecting, interpreting, choreographing, and archiving our experiences. The reader is engaged in a vivid narrative linking our neurobiology to mental processes and overt behaviors. As we read, we are informed that the capacity to feel safe in the arms of another, which is the sine qua non of our survival, is selectively damaged by trauma. We learn that effective therapy incorporates an understanding of the mechanisms through which an individual can feel safe, as well as understands, witnesses, and respects the vulnerability of these mechanisms to trauma. It seems we human beings are designed to function most humanely when right mode processing takes the lead and provides the vision, or, as McGilchrist would say, is the master. No gender intended, and the left mode becomes the vital emissary who can provide understanding and build systems to bring the vision of the right into stable form. In the moment-to-moment unfolding, in the counseling room, this wisdom can provide a solid enough foundation that we can open into truly following our people. Both hemispheres are essential, and the relationship between them is all important. By all indications, we in the developed nations are not living in that world now. Instead, a pronounced shift toward left dominance has occurred, most dramatically since the Industrial Revolution. The great tragedy of this shift is that it leaves us unable to even notice that we are in trouble because we are cut off from our body's distress signals. McGilchrist's understanding illuminates not what each hemisphere does, but how each perceives and then creates the world. This abundant and meticulous exploration of the research supports the perspective that we are currently immersed in a culture operating primarily according to the viewpoint of the left. This hemisphere sees through the lens of a relationally disconnected manufacturing mentality that we can recognize in the accelerating pace of life, the emphasis on behavior and task over relationship, the tendency to value algorithms over individual process, the polarized and judgmental either-or way of seeing the world, and many other characteristics. This affects the systems within which we work, the way we see one another, and define mental health, and even our capacity to be truly present with each other. In some indigenous cultures, the intention is to pause and look with deep eyes to recognize and reflect the humanity of the other person, because to be unseen is to fall out of existence in some important way. In these communities, this isn't metaphorical, but a living experience. Implicit in this greeting is the sense that who you see me to be calls forth that aspect of me. The tinted lens of my particular perception invites you to manifest those qualities. It is so important for us to stay connected with others that often without conscious awareness we will shape our malleable selves around the person seeing us a particular way. We all ache to be heard and held in the reality of our experience without judgment or any impulse toward fixing. Perhaps this leads to the natural conclusion that healing trauma might be an embodied and relational experience between patient and therapist as well, with our people's wise inner world leading the way while we hold a safe, warm, stable, responsive space. The research on memory reconsolidation points to responsiveness to what is alive in the moment as the central capacity in cultivating a space that supports shifting the felt sense and behavioral patterns of implicit memories. It is this embodied reawakening of embedded traumas in the form of bodily sensations, surges of emotion, behavioral impulses, and perceptual shifts that flow into our daily lives as these unhealed memories, when touched by inner or outer events, well up, coloring every aspect of our world. A person who bears suffering with grace. This brings me to another word that finds a place here, sacred. As we move into close contact with one another, something sometimes happens that can't be defined. The space between seems to hold a deepening sense of meaning, expanding vistas of compassion, co-suffering of great intensity at times, and then, often quite suddenly, where the two worlds meet, the door is round and open. What happens next is as individual as a fingerprint, an expanded sense of oneness with others, a movement towards action on behalf of those in need, the feeling of being held by the divine, an experience of stillness spreading throughout the body. There is always a sense of something larger, deeper than words unfolding, touching both people in the sacred space between. The gift of being present for such openings, of participating simply by being present, illuminates our work in a way that we may simply call blessed. At the most basic and pervasive level, we shape one another's embodied brains from pre-birth to death. Cosolino 2014, Siegel 2015. Our nervous systems continually ask this question: are you with me? The answer is yes, when we are present and available to one another, without judgment or agenda in that moment, which is a right hemisphere state. True safety, true presence, true listening. Social baseline theory tells us that when we have a felt sense of being accompanied, everything becomes easier and less painful, freeing our resources for relating and creating. Our primary emotional motivational systems in the midbrain are arranged so that remaining in connection is the first priority. Developing radical inclusiveness is not primarily a cognitive process. Neuroscience gives us support for making a case that our protective feelings and behaviors are adaptive, both then and now, so we may be able to accept this premise fairly easily. However, this alone isn't enough to change how we perceive and receive our people and ourselves. The important movement is toward the embodied acceptance of what is, as being meaningful and valuable, even when we don't understand it or like it. We empathize effortlessly and automatically with each other because evolution has selected neural systems that blend self and others' actions, intentions, and emotions. The more we learn about the neural mechanisms of mirroring, the more we realize that the distinction between self and other may be almost fictitious in many cases. We have created the self-other distinction in our explicit discourse, along with many other constructs that divide us. Our neurobiology, in contrast, puts us within each other. Ian McGilchrist, 2009, says something quite powerful about how we see one another. Attention is not just another function alongside other cognitive functions. Its ontological status is of something prior to functions and even to things. The kind of attention we bring to bear on the world changes the nature of the world we attend to, the very nature of the world in which those functions would be carried out and in which those things would exist. Attention changes what kind of a thing comes into being for us. In that way, it changes the world. In all these circumstances, you will also have a quite different experience, not just of me, the one attending, but of yourself. You would feel change if I changed the type of my attention. And yet, nothing objectively has changed. How we attend to the world, each other, and ourselves does matter. As McGilchrist and the indigenous people of Africa remind us, we call forth in others what we see in them. I see you, and I am here, receiving people as continually adaptive because we have done the work to embody the knowing that this is true for us and for all, gives them and us a solid foundation of hope and respect, on which we can both stand throughout our work. The story begins with parallels to Ian McGilchrist's work. In the simplest terms, our way of attending strongly influences what we see and what we feel when we see. Two pathways are built into our optic nerve that facilitate two processes of attention. Both gather information about the outside world, traveling along axons from neurons in the cornea and retina through the thalamus and onto the visual cortex. These neurons speak to each other with the same language as other nerve cells, a variety of neurotransmitters. Based on evidence from brainwaves that are observable through neurofeedback, some researchers in fact postulate that the parvo stream is wired to the left hemisphere while the magno stream is linked to the right hemisphere. This does not appear to be true at the structural level, since both streams reach both hemispheres. However, because of how each stream pays attention, magno cells offer a more right-centric experience and parvo cells a more left-centric. They literally see something different and provide divergent felt sense experiences. Femi and Robbins see magnocentric as diffuse attention and parvocentric as narrow focus attention. The diffuse way of seeing offers an immersive, in-the-moment experience of being present, while narrow focus objectifies what we are looking at, leading to a sense of separation. When there is a sense of threat arising either internally or externally, our focus of attention adaptively narrows so that we are concentrating on the source of the danger without other stimuli pulling us away, activating the central parvo cells. Even low levels of threat that don't rise to conscious awareness call on us to alleviate danger by seeking to control the situation, which requires close focus on the next steps we need to take to survive. Even more subtly, when we shift left at the expense of the right, that in itself initiates a separation from our main source of security. These changes in our eyes are parallel to the movements of our ANS. Let's begin with the anatomy of our eyes, which returns us to the relationship between our exposed and hidden nervous systems that we explored with touch. The cornea, the outer covering or skin of the eye, has 6 layers. The outermost develops from the portion of the ectoderm that becomes the skin, and the innermost from the neuroectoderm that becomes the nervous system. The optic nerve, the neural highway that brings the outside inside, is similarly built from neuroectoderm cells. More than a biological understanding, this perhaps gives us a felt sense of the fluid intimacy between the tissues that encounter the outer world and the deep nervous system that receives and organizes that world within us. When you look into the darkness of someone's pupils, though, you encounter her non-objective self, her being. And let's be clear about this. The pupils are black holes. They are empty and the retina beyond is black. To look at the pupil is not to look at an object any more than looking into darkness through the mouth of a cave is looking at an object. There is nothing in the dark emptiness of the pupil to actually see or describe or objectify or know, and yet, by looking into it, you connect with someone's life. You encounter her being, and in that encounter, you precipitate an exchange of energies in which you are both participant. We may easily remember times when we have engaged in such an exchange and felt known in some profound way. Our eyes are surely meant to nourish us with their capacity for immersion in one another and the world. But similarly, when somebody is in their fight or flight, their eyes will have a different expression, and you really don't want to look into such eyes, because the gaze is hard, almost metallic, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. It's like a threat. When sympathetic and dorsal pathways become well-worn and familiar during the course of our lives, especially if there has been very little activation of ventral, these become our most easily accessed ANS states. Even in such challenging circumstances, we social beings continue to seek and prefer warm, responsive connections. We can rely on our ANS to respond to offers of safety by carrying us toward ventral vagal engagement as soon as the environment turns from hostile to welcoming. Countless times I have seen the wide, tense eyes of fear and the dull eyes of withdrawal gradually soften and enliven as we are able to orient to one another's presence in this moment, drinking in this relational nourishment, sometimes through moments of gazing. Culturally, we find ourselves at a crisis point in terms of ongoing low-level sympathetic activation. There is a reciprocal relationship between fear and the tendency to shift into left hemisphere dominance. In general, the conditions of our culture are not conducive to ventral settling, and once we have made the adaptive shift into left hemisphere dominance, our disconnection from others, combined with cultural conditions, supports remaining in that state. This draws many of us into at least mild ongoing tension and weariness, although we are mostly unaware of this until some major emotional or health crisis overtakes us. The silent signals we send to each other are intended to have the same protective effect as someone yelling fire, Adding the quality of sound, our vocal cords change so that the prosody of our voice can telegraph the sense of danger to others for their safety. While most of the shifts are activating, some move in the opposite direction. Digestion, immune responses, and reproduction are viewed as non-essential processes that need to be temporarily turned down or off. We can now begin to imagine what challenges there are to the bodies of those of us who are in a state of sympathetic arousal, mild or intensive, most of the time. Given the speed and ongoing demands of our culture, it is more common to be in the state of arousal than we may believe. It may not be surprising that it is estimated that 75 to 90% of doctor visits are related to stress, or that so many of our patients report regular gastric distress, or that autoimmune diseases are dramatically on the rise. Our current left-shifted culture of speed, task focus, and overwhelm requires us to stay exclusively in parvos narrow focus the majority of the time, with harmful consequences for muscles, bellies, nervous systems, and relationships. As with all other neural streams, once this pathway is deeply ingrained, it is challenging to leave. Potentially traumatic experience, if it doesn't bring on dissociation, holds us in parvos tight focus while events unfold. Undigested trauma has a tendency to keep us there, as we either protect ourselves by focusing away from reminders of the experience, or feel the danger all over again when implicit memory is touched and awakened. Those of us who have experienced trauma of whatever intensity and duration will likely be especially sensitive to some degree to fluctuations in the prosody of other voices. Small shifts into sympathetic activation on the part of the speaker, the kind that can occur when we are experiencing judgments or have the intention to intervene or fix, may touch and stimulate loud echoes of earlier threatening voices. The accompanying shifts in the ANS of the listener can look out of proportion unless we remember that his or her system is responding from the depth of internalized experience rather than this moment only. At the other end of the spectrum, if we are able to notice this rupture and release our judgments and intentions, our vocal cords will rearrange themselves as we enter a ventral state. The prosody of our voice, conveying receptivity and kindness, can then become a nourishing elixir, bathing the neural streams that are alert for danger in the healing wash of safety. We can begin to sense how embedded trauma decreases our capacity to take in nourishment at all levels, down to our cells, while co-healing of those experiences restores our inherent capacity for growth. How many of our own daily experiences are being touched by unseen and unknowable influences from past generations? As clinicians, parents, partners, and fellow human beings, this awareness may deepen our humility and kindness concerning what we believe we know about the roots of another person's thoughts, feelings, behavior, and relational choices. It can become a helpful practice for reducing judgment. As I work with my people, I find I am less concerned these days with understanding the explicit history of their implicit patterns. These connections and stories often do emerge, and that can be helpful in setting our people's left hemisphere need for something concrete. However, if they don't emerge, or if it seems there is something beyond the connection with what was experienced earlier in life. Throughout our lives, we accumulate many more implicit than explicit memories, building a rich and completely individual library of perceptual guidance that shapes what we see and how we see it. There is no stepping away from this multifaceted lens. These embodied memories hold the full spectrum, from the felt sense of those encoded experiences that support the sense of hope and goodness in us and the world, to those that contain the remnants of frightening and painful experiences. The former integrate more fully throughout our brains, providing easy access to what sustains us, while the latter are tucked away in subcortical and bodily pathways, awaiting healing. The two themes of inherent health and implicit memory come together as we consider the wisdom embodied in the processes of how potential traumas embed and how they always remain available for healing. As we attend to our bodies, we come into direct contact with the streams of implicit memory, refining our capacity to hear the truth-telling voices of embedded traumas that have no words to offer, while also discovering the memories in need of healing in us. Then we will be better able to support our patients when the only witness to their earlier experiences is an upset stomach or tension around the heart. Our left hemispheres may want procedures and step-by-step directions for how to undo the symptoms of embedded traumas, but the wisdom of the right-centric way of attending that we are cultivating suggests that we let go of linearity in favor of fluidity. Then these well-learned methods can be allowed to flow with what is emerging in the moment rather than according to a predetermined pattern. We could say that our amygdala is one center that holds our well-being and distress. From about the 8 months of gestation onward, our amygdala-centric pathways build up an implicit perceptual lens based on the quality of our interpersonal and cultural experience. In one sense, we can step outside this lens to see and feel ourselves and our lives differently. In another, with our neocortical capacity to generate a bit of distance from our experience, we can begin to see the patterns and have both an understanding and felt sense of their origin. We have begun to consider how the well-educated left hemisphere emissary may help the right-centric master by providing an underlying stability of understanding that holds the tentative emergent processes of relationship. Our left hemispheres have a strong tendency to separate processes into components and then privilege one over another. Coming from the more right-centric view of our embodied brains, we are more able to work in the complexity and sometimes confusion of multiple systems in interaction with each other. This kind of respectful holding of the whole is the foundation for safety and opens the door to healing. The many streams of information flowing upward from the body and inward from the senses, although the wisdom of how these flows of information enter our lateralized brains comes from the circuits below. For example, activation of the ventral vagal parasympathetic nerve lateralizes right, as does information about the state of our bodies in the moment. The former supports social engagement, a primary concern of the right hemisphere, and the latter serves to give us the felt sense of what is emerging in the moment. The work of Stephen Porges points to a tripartite nervous system that more closely corresponds to our experience of moving in tandem with changing conditions. Social creatures that we are, our ANS seems designed to foster connecting with one another. It is arranged in a hierarchical manner, so that the pathways supporting attachment are preferred and remain active as long as we have a neuroception of safety. Returning to our discussion in the introduction, Porges coined this word to emphasize that we have an embodied way of experiencing emotional safe, not safe, that is independent of conscious awareness. The processes of consciousness involving the neocortex are so slow compared to those that are responsible for the rapid assessment of threat and safety, arising in the body, brainstem, and subcortical networks, that neuroception is our essential guardian. Receiving information from both current external experience and the ongoing internal flow of implicit and explicit memory, our ANS continually adapts. When our system senses that we are no longer having a neuroception of safety, we adaptively move into intensified sympathetic arousal. These pathways strongly innervate the gut and other organs below the diaphragm, while also influencing the face, eyes, and heart. While this activating system is always contributing some of its circuits to our aliveness in play and curious exploration, additional neural streams are now activated for protection. Social engagement diminishes, so we won't be distracted from the source of threat, and whoever is with us will feel this shift away from connection. The tension in our ear muscle relaxes to take in the whole environment, listening for the sounds of danger, deep rhythmic pounding and shrill sounds, at the cost of focusing less closely on what others are saying. The person we are relating with in the moment will feel this loss of attentiveness. We lose the orientation toward one another that calms our system, along with the sense of meaning that arises from being connected to something larger than the needs and wants of our individual self. In short-term conditions of threat, these changes are essential for survival. As a long-term strategy for safety in a threatening world, our system deems them necessary even with the considerable cost they bring. At certain moments, danger may escalate to the point where we have a neuroception of helplessness. Then the third ANS branch, the unmyelinated dorsal vagal parasympathetic, awakens to slow our system in preparation for the possibility of death, and also activate an ancient strategy to conserve metabolic resources in case we don't die. At the other end of the spectrum, when our threatened system senses that fight and flight are impossible, additional pathways are activated, and wisdom guides our movement toward collapse and dissociation as our heart and breath rate slow. Sign of aliveness and engagement leave our face and eyes. Endorphins are released to diminish the pain of death, and the sacral parasympathetic pathways may release our urinary tract and bowels. At the same time, our system is conserving metabolic resources for a safer time when we can come back into our bodies again. When we experience humiliation, we are right at the gateway of dorsal vagal activation. The movement of withdrawal that shame brings, painful though it is, looks like wisdom when there is an onslaught of criticism, hatred, or disgust. Our systems adaptively move away from the rejection of our being toward a kind of hibernation until the storm passes. In even more severe circumstances, dorsal activation can save our lives, as our system abandons fight or flight for submission. As with chronic sympathetic activation, even in the midst of this adaptive response to intolerable conditions, the cost for our bodies and relationships can be quite severe, especially if our circumstances draw us repeatedly toward dissociation. Our awareness of the intricacies of our ANS can help stabilize our own systems, enhance our awareness of the shifts in activation that our people are experiencing, and also give us words to share with them so they can understand the adaptive nature of the activations of their system. Autonomic nervous system guardian of safety. The moment-to-moment sensitivity and responsiveness of our autonomic nervous systems, ANS, to our felt sense of safety and threat is astonishing in its unfailing instinct to protect. Mostly below conscious awareness, these bidirectional neural pathways mediate the activity of our visceral system to support our capacity to be moved in synchrony with our felt sense of current internal and external conditions. These microsecond adjustments that engage the complex interaction of the various autonomic pathways provide a symphony of responsiveness that we can trust to foster our safest possible passage through life. Given what is active internally and what is arriving through the senses, all investigations into our physiology go through stages of development arising from a curiosity about what processes underlie our felt sense experience. In the presence of an experience that we neuroceive as dangerous, our systems will automatically and adaptively tighten at many levels to prepare for protective action. Numerous pathways, including our enteric and autonomic nervous systems, brainstem, limbic region, and some aspects of the cortex, will participate in sending messages to tighten our muscles. We are designed also adaptively to release this tension when the neuroception of safety returns. However, for many of us, probably most of us, that return to safety is elusive and infrequent for the cultural reasons we have been exploring and because of historical remnants of our own earlier experiences that linger in our muscles. In this case, the ascending arc of the circle, which is always active, sends the message upward from chronically tight muscles that danger is still present. That message, in turn, helps maintain the tension in that particular muscle group and supports an ongoing neuroception of danger, often at such a low level that we have no conscious awareness. As we noted, a good deal of this activation is also likely happening outside our conscious awareness as an automatic adaptive response that is taking into account both what is entering through our senses and what is alive within our complex implicit memory system. Given these circumstances, we might say that our tense muscles are acting as our allies in survival by keeping us alert to danger, as it has been instilled over the course of our life so far. At the same time, the chronic tension is decreasing the nourishment these cells are receiving by restricting the flow of oxygen-carrying blood to the muscles. Quote Porges and say, "We wear our hearts on our faces and in our voices. As our nervous system influences our body's moment-to-moment expression, automatically offering a sense of safety or danger to one another. We are keenly and continuously attuned to these messages flowing in the space between, mostly below the level of conscious awareness. These interpersonal communications intertwine with our unique perceptual vantage point, shaped by our life's experiences, yielding our body's sense of how safe we are in this moment. Porges' word for this unfolding process is neuroception, our bodies receiving, understanding, and adapting in their own unique ways to the flow of information from other bodies, particularly through face and voice quality. In ventral vagal, our vocal cords are automatically tuned in such a way that the nervous systems of those around us recognize our sounds as conveying safety. Similarly, the tension in our small muscle near our inner ears is increased so we can focus on the human voice and orient to the meaning of the words. Our eyes respond by moving into an alert but relaxed state that allows our system to take in and respond to the internal condition of another. Our heart rate is gentled by application of the vagal brake. Even the mobility of our face sends signals to all who see us that there is safety here and we can settle into relationship with one another. There is no faking a ventral voice or face. It is likely that every neural system in our body is touched in some way by this simple offer of attentive contact. We might think of this practice with our muscles as one of many doorways into the wider system that is always waiting for the arrival of what was needed but missing at the time a potentially traumatic event took place. As we consider the other neural systems within the body, our autonomic nervous system next, keeping this ripple effect in view, can help us maintain our right hemisphere balance as we feed our left with helpful information. Interestingly, this process of restoration may not feel at all like what our conscious minds imagine. From a left hemisphere perspective, there is a right way for muscles to be, and they should be moving in that direction. From the more open and listening perspective of the right, anything might happen, and it often does. People have reported a sense of gratitude arising in the contact between muscles and hand. Others have felt either an increase or decrease in tension and pain. The increase often seems to carry the felt sense of the muscles saying, "This is how hard it was." When we approach this practice of receptive listening without expectations, the wisdom in our muscles will guide the next arising. With this practice, we are getting into relationship with our muscles. What does that mean? We are inviting the neural pathways that support attention to connect with the neural pathways of our muscles, or drawing someone else in to join us in our attending if we have invited a partner. The energy being held by the muscles was often generated in the context of relationship and in response to painful or frightening experience. From this vantage point, proving gentle direct contact that brings acknowledgement of what is, without needing anything to be different, might bring enough receptive presence for the system as a whole to feel safe. As we have seen, the inherent wisdom will know what to do from there to begin the process of release that will restore the system to a more fully nourished and flowing state. Sitting quietly, with as few expectations as possible, simply ask your muscles if there is a particular group that would like attention right now. Then just listen, noticing if you feel drawn to a particular muscle group. It may be a familiar location of tension or someplace new. Once you feel settled, slowly bring your hand into gentle contact with these particular muscles, following your sense of just where to place your hand. If you can't reach the group who called you, gently bring your mind into contact with that spot. This is potentially a moment of meeting and acknowledgement, of listening and respectful exchange, with a little judgment and need for a particular kind of change as possible. Just arrive, settle into relationship, and listen. Some people begin to do this practice every day, morning and evening, since it takes less than 2 minutes most of the time. They report a sense of ease and growing trust in their body's wisdom. All of this happens just from listening to our muscles. Bringing the broader perspective back into view, we can again sense how all our neural pathways are talking with each other. As we bring our kind attention to our muscles, we are already engaging parts of our prefrontal cortex and limbic system, including the right insula, whose job it is to keep above and below connected in an emotionally meaningful way. The receptors in our skin attend not only to the quality of the touch, but also to its emotional meaning. Our gentle intention to not fix or change anything communicates with our autonomic nervous system, calming it. This message of safety soothes the fight-flight nuclei in the brain stem and touches the emotional motivational systems that are sensitive to connection in the midbrain. Interoception is awareness, conscious or not, of information from our internal organs. Proprioception lets us know about our position and movement, and is drawn from muscle tension, tendons, and joints, also conscious or not. And exteroception brings the external world inside through the senses, much more outside conscious awareness than within it. The experience of being touched follows these spinal cord tracts, while our eyes, ears, noses, and tongues have their own unique pathways closer to the skull brain. The descending tract carry information from various cortical and brainstem nuclei to support maintenance of motor activities such as posture, balance, muscle tone, and visceral and somatic reflex activity. Although defensive reactions are necessary for survival, optimally these strategies should be recruited for acute transitory challenges and not for chronic states of vigilance. Although chronic states of vigilance prepare the individual to efficiently defend. The neural demands to maintain this state result in adaptive retuning of the autonomic nervous system. This retuning optimizes defense by reducing the latency to defend, but also manifests in the autonomic nervous system, promoting an array of mental disorders, e.g., anxiety, depression, PTSD, etc., and physical disorders, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, dysautonomia, migraine, etc. Thus, clinicians collaborating with survivors of trauma observe the behavioral and emotional defensive reactivity of their clients, even in the supportive context of a therapy session. Clinicians are also aware of the physical and health symptoms that frequently appear to be comorbid with survivors of trauma. The quality of care we receive, particularly in the context of meeting our need for nourishment in the form of food and emotional support, will guide the emergence of epigenetic patterns as these new connections to both our digestive tract and immune system are established. Burns, Roberts, Bornstein and Young, 2009. Another example of the centrality of relationships in the course of neural development, these epigenetics will then play their part in our ongoing relationship with nourishment. Hoban and colleagues, 2016, say this: in summary, we believe we demonstrate for the first time that the microbiome is necessary for appropriate and dynamic regulation of myelin-related genes. Regulation seems to be a key word here, as we picture how our microbial companions are essential for maintaining balance throughout our system. All of this is rather revolutionary news that directs our attention toward the wider networks centrally involved in our emotional life and mental health. To support digestion, the ENS is distributed along the entire length of the alimentary canal, which we might also call the nurturant canal, from esophagus to anus. Its neurons are embedded in the wall of the digestive tract and reach out to the part of our immune system that lies just on the other side of the ENS as well. ENS being enteric nervous system. The research suggests that signals from beneficial bacteria are able to find a way through the blood-brain barrier to communicate with the higher centers of our brain. It appears that our gut bugs are able to touch a sensory nerve ending in the finger-like protrusion lining the intestine and carry that electrical impulse up the vagus nerve and into the deep brain structures thought to be responsible for elemental emotions like anxiety. In this way, our microbial colony, belly, brain, autonomic nervous system, brainstem, and limbic system carry on a continual conversation, influencing not only digestive health, but our perceptions, feelings, and behaviors. More recently, researchers have found that the microbiome also regulates the production of myelin in the prefrontal cortices of mice through working directly with the genes that instruct glial cells to make the insulating conducting substance. The potential influence of painful or frightening experiences during and after birth on both digestion and immune strength. At the same time, we might have a complementary felt sense of the possible amelioration of these experiences if we are surrounded by people who understand our need for ongoing emotionally rich responsive support during and after such potentially traumatic events. While the digestive tract itself is similar to our outside skin and has analogous functions of both protection from harm and reception of nourishment, it is much more delicate, so that at certain points nutrients can pass through on the way to entering our cells. The fragility of this barrier both supports nourishment and may make us vulnerable to conditions that can potentially disrupt the lining, ranging from eating processed foods to the prolonged sympathetic activation of stress. If there is such disruption, it can also potentially influence our immune system's response to the inner environment. Between the belly and the skull, brain lies a third center of neural wisdom, the little brain of the heart. Each of us may immediately relate to the vivid sensations that radiate throughout our chest, particularly in response to relational experiences. We may feel the contracting ache that speaks to us of a personal loss, or the suffering of others, and the delight that floods the whole expanse between our shoulders at the sight of a loved one. Looking inward, we can begin to picture the intrinsic cardiac neurons that reside within the heart itself and the rosette-like companions of the extracardiac neural groups that inhabit the thoracic cavity, together fostering the capaciousness of these feelings. As they interact with our autonomic nervous system, insula, limbic circuits, and neocortex, they hold the truth of our ongoing experience of connection and disconnection with others, sometimes bringing it into conscious awareness, but often not. The heart is also the home of a rich sea of hormones, blood-borne chemicals. This little brain not only is the recipient of the support these chemicals provide, but also makes oxytocin, the hormone that facilitates trusting relationships of all kinds. The concentration of this chemical in the heart is about the same as in the skull brain. The presence of oxytocin perhaps further supports our felt sense that this cardiac brain is as central to our ongoing implicit embodied anticipations about relationships as our belly brain is to our core sense of safety. Each edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders earnestly seeks to enumerate with greater accuracy the symptoms of particular patterns of mental illness, often identifying subtypes through noticing that people with a given diagnosis aren't all alike. As the categories proliferate and narrow, there is a tacit sense that the pressures of individuality are trying to crack open the boxes, but the needs of the left-centric system can only respond by creating ever smaller boxes. It isn't primarily the process of identifying a diagnosis that disturbs the ground of safety and openness with our patients. Often this is just something that has to be done and may have little influence on how we see our people. However, if at a deep level we experience them as disordered, mentally ill, and diseased, that will often call forth in them a part who likely already believes that they are damaged goods. Shame, protectiveness, and helpless, hopeless feelings are often nearby companions of this perception, making connection more challenging. One of my people shared this about her experience with a previous therapist. When he said I had an adjustment disorder, I felt boxed up and dealt with in some way. He had me figured out, so I felt little inclination to share anything that didn't match his belief about me. I wonder now if I just abandoned myself. My thought at the time was that without any intention to do so, her therapist may actually have abandoned her, in all her uniqueness and complexity. Both the perspective of disorder and of adaptation can have an upside and downside. Being seen as disordered has a tendency to provoke the sense that there is something wrong with us, something that perhaps needs to be fixed. When that observation is offered by another, there can be a kind of objectification of the person that may lead to a felt sense of separation rather than connection. Disorders are a collection of symptoms based on discrete pieces of data boiled down into an overall picture that likely doesn't apply to any individual exactly or continuously. Once we have been settled into a category by the one observing us, curiosity about what else might be there, the sense of the uniqueness of the person, and fluid contact with the emerging moment may all be limited or lost. In general, the perspective of disorder arises from a more left-centric way of attending, so it isn't surprising that there can be both a quality of judgment and felt sense of disconnection. Perhaps we could approach diagnoses not as a series of small, confining boxes, but as a set of fuzzy lines that point us toward a general sense of how our people have adapted to the suffering in their lives. We might be able to let go of the word disorder, to see these categories as a way our left hemisphere emissary can support some focused attention on particular adjustments their systems have made in an effort to survive, isolating experiences of pain and fear. Then, rather than diagnosis becoming a left-centric strategy that fosters separation, it might become a support for clarity and deepening empathy. On the other hand, for both patient and therapist, there can be a sense of greater settledness with a diagnosis in place. For example, autism. I think it's important to have that diagnosis. Our left hemispheres bring us certain gifts: stability, predictability, clarity, and relative simplicity compared to the teeming unknowability of the ever-emerging right. Our patients sometimes find that a previous sense of just being crazy is quieted by a diagnosis that gives their upset a recognizable shape. At the same time, we clinicians may find comfort and relief from anxiety in the process of putting a boundary around our patients' distress, while also creating some cognitive distance between them and us, so we do not feel so overwhelmed as we continue to resonate with their inner world. Our current capacity for attending is not a choice so much as a response. When we hold this view, rather than the more critical stance that a person ought to be able to focus his or her attention, we become more likely to be able to support the emergence of a sense of safety in another. A judgmental perspective involves some degree of sympathetic activation that pulls us out of the relationship and away from ventral openness to what is emerging in the moment, while the relaxation of judgment into curiosity about what may be touching another system and making it difficult to pay attention supports our own ventral state. A right-centric way of attending opens us to relationships within the whole and to what is unfolding in each present moment, while a left-centric viewpoint tunes us to fine detail and to generalizing from specific to algorithm. Science generally favors the latter way of attending. Attuning to these distinctions in ways of attending, we can perhaps find a respectful, inclusive perspective that honors science along with other perspectives that arrive at knowledge in a different way, such as through the rich felt sense experience of our daily lives. This perspective is aware of the uncertainty of the next moment and the next, and keenly attuned to both the suffering and the potential meaningfulness of life. There can be a broad acceptance of paradox, a both-and way of meeting what comes, and deep respect for the fullness of implicit experience. It is also here that we make and sustain living connections with one another, and here that the guiding vision for a humane society might arise. The individual, the unique, the unrepeatable, the irreplaceable, the unpredictable, the interpersonal, all live here. This intention seems to call for right-centric metaphorical language to embody the felt sense, even while seeking to convey solid understanding of what neuroscience tells us about healing from trauma in the context of relationships, a challenging combination at times. It is no small thing to offer to enter this consideration of suffering. To truly deepen into the nature of trauma means that our own wounds will be touched, in the hope that you will feel accompanied as you move into this tender territory. This book itself may be a kind of companion for you, if you prefer to read by yourself. Based on these discoveries, Hesson says, coupling is not a result of understanding. It is the neural basis on which we understand one another. We're suggesting that communication is a single act performed by two brains. He describes this as a visceral process in which we influence one another at multiple levels by linking our embodied brains. In the intimacy of our counseling rooms, the shared narrative of our ever-unfolding relationship gradually takes form within both brains, a process of mutual and ongoing co-organization. Panksepp originally chose to capitalize the words for these pathways to indicate that he is speaking about specific circuits in the midbrain while using common terms that try to capture their essence. The first, and what Panksepp calls the granddaddy of them all, is the seeking system. It is an anticipatory eagerness, supporting curiosity and exploration, and particularly animated by anything new, before being shaped by our daily life experiences. It is a goat without a goal, a feeling of eye-brightening interest. We could think of it as the psycho-behavioral push that animates most of the other primary emotions and behaviors. It is anticipatory delight rather than the reward we experience when we get what we were seeking. Not surprisingly, its circuitry is in a midbrain area that is rich in dopamine production. The primary experience of rage arises in times of scarcity, not times of abundance. Its behavioral corollary is striking out to protect ourselves. Panksepp and Bevan say this about rage. It is not fundamentally designed to punish, but rather to bring others in line, rapidly, with one's implicit evolutionary desires. In other words, the protective intention is to draw our person back to us again. However, by the time this primary process emotion encounters our higher centers, it has transformed into all manner of feelings and plans: anger, hatred, revenge, aggression, ongoing irritation, or blaming, to name a very small sample. All of these have a tendency to produce the opposite of the original intention, to renew connection. Once connection is re-established, the rage system is quieted by the release of endogenous opioids and oxytocin. At that point, another system is free to come online: play. No longer required for focusing on maintaining connection, the seeking system's energies can begin to range freely as exploration and add their enthusiasm and love of novelty to the unpredictable world of interpersonal play. It is spontaneous, joyful, and explores the edge where connections can be made and lost. In this way, it becomes a process of social learning, in the midst of just playing. Panksepp and Bevan tell us that the play system is both robust and fragile. Grief brings a biologically healthy and helpful social behavior of wanting to cling, while fear activates the bodily impulse to fight or flee, specifically not a social but a survival response. Their dominant neurochemical environments are also somewhat different. Grief diminishes the care chemicals of oxytocin and endogenous opioids, leaving us feeling deeply alone, sad, and yearning, while fear increases the threat response chemicals to prepare our bodies for action. In the long term, the human need to be social supplants other survival needs beyond the most primitive needs of oxygen, food, water, and physical safety. Social isolation is a powerful disruptor of human behavior and physiological health. In the clinical domain of traumatology, isolation, whether physical or psychological, is conceptualized as neglect. In addition, other forms of social marginalization, such as bullying, are interpreted by our nervous system similarly to isolation. Isolation triggers feelings of despair that are captured metaphorically by a nervous system signaling its viscera to initially become aggressive, fight-flight behaviors, and then subsequently to shut down and appear to be dormant. These responses and this sequence are encoded in our genes. Functionally, the survivor's nervous system resists being coaxed and cajoled into a state of safety. It is a nervous system that obstinately refuses to dismiss its responsibility to protect and defend. These neurobiological features, which are frequently expressed following trauma, are independent of volitions, desires, and even explicit cognitive narratives. Survivors of trauma may have thoughts and mental images of welcoming others in a warm embrace, but their bodies are hypervigilant and resist engagement to protect and defend. In sculpting the theme embedded in the heart of trauma, Badenoch brilliantly centers on the clinical question of how therapists guide survivors of trauma to recover their capacity to connect with humanity when their bodies are in a chronic state of defense. Trauma explains the neural mechanisms through which trauma disrupts the capacity to feel safe. This knowledge provides insights into re-engaging the safety system to effectively and efficiently contain defense reactions. Insights into the mechanisms that disrupt feeling safe, inform therapists to develop trauma treatments designed to awaken the circuits that enable feelings of safety. Although optimizing survival, chronic recruitment of defense strategies limits opportunities for pro-social interactions and functionally marginalizes the individual from social contact. Evolution of the nervous system enabled humans to access and regulate two defense strategies. One is associated with the increased energy necessary for mobilization and fight-flight behaviors, and the other is associated with a conservation of energy and manifests in a massive reduction of behavior, enabling the mammalian ancestors of humans to appear to be inanimate. For humans, the system, when recruited, may result in a behavioral shutdown and a mental state of dissociation. Moreover, evolution provided humans and other mammals with a third adaptive system that down-regulates the sensitivity to trigger defense by detecting and responding to cues of safety. Results of colonization of native peoples in Western Canada, robbed of their natural environment, their culture, and often their children, these people experienced feelings of loss, isolation, dislocation, rage, and helplessness. Not unlike rats locked in a Skinner box. Prior to such spiritual and social trauma and incarceration being placed on reservations, the native peoples exhibited no tendency toward addiction. Once these events occurred, addiction, beginning with easily available alcohol, was almost universal. Even more telling, he found that in the absence of addictive substances, the people so devastated by the loss of their way of life exhibited many of the symptoms of addiction anyway. They stopped doing work and no longer cared for their families. The adaptive nature of addiction, when the cage of the culture creates a hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive, frantic, crisis-ridden society that makes most people feel social and culturally isolated. Addiction as an adaptation to the felt sense of isolation, slowly influencing how we perceive and treat the burgeoning number of addicts responding to the stress and loneliness of this left-shifted society. The central idea of interpersonal neurobiology is that integration is at the heart of well-being. Integration is the linking of differentiated elements into a functional whole. With an integrated system, our lives become flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. Without this integration, the flow of our minds moves toward rigidity or chaos. In this way, trauma can be seen to fundamentally impair integration within an individual, dyad, family, or community. Post-traumatic states are filled with experiences of rigidity or chaos that continue the devastation of trauma long past the initial overwhelming events. By integrating many domains of our experience within a receptive form of awareness, we develop a more connected and harmonious flow in our lives. Such linkages include implicit with explicit memory, left with right hemisphere modes of processing, and mindful awareness with bodily sensation. One central focus of these writings is that when we can put down roots in the right mode felt sense of relationship, we arrive at the possible activation of our innate healing capacities, which arise in the relational space between patient and practitioner. One of the pioneering teachers in the biodynamic craniosacral tradition speaks of the inherent treatment plan, grounded in deep listening to the wise adaptive system of the patient. This pathway has the opportunity to unfold as we cultivate our capacity to stay in contact with what is emerging within our patients from moment to moment, with sufficient safety and care in the space between. Unhealed implicit memories can be guided toward the surface by the inherent wisdom that knows how to move our patient system toward greater coherence. Two themes emerged that have lingered with me: the powerful influence of the cultural context enveloping us as we do our work, and the importance of presence for holding what wants to unfold in the space between patient and therapist. If you had asked any of us at the beginning if we felt we were present with our clients, all of us would have said yes. Yet, by the end of our time, I believe everyone would have agreed that a different felt sense of what presence can be had emerged. An openness experienced throughout the body, listening from increasing stillness, fewer thoughts and less planning. A deepening trust that such holding can allow our patient's wisdom to reveal itself.